Okay, that's a good one. Do you advise TZM followers to go vegan? If not, why? Okay, so I'll start us off on this one. Well, it depends if you care about environmental sustainability and want to sort of champion some of the values based around that, I would sort of say is the argument back, because there's no argument that the animal agriculture industry is the most harmful industry we engage in towards everything from global warming to environmental destruction. It's very often not touted as that. Many people say, oh, it's planes and things. Actually, no, I can't remember the stats on this necessarily off the top of my head, but it's anywhere between, I'll butcher it, so I'm not going to bother. But it's yeah, probably wise. Basically, it's massive, the effect. And for me personally, I don't really do the moral argument. Not because I necessarily think it's valid or invalid. I certainly think the way we treat animals on this planet at the moment is despicable. But I think the same thing about each other. I think the way we treat each other is not that great. However, if you don't need meat or animal products to have a sustainable diet, and it's the most harmful thing that you engage in as a species, if you want to call yourself an environmental activist but eat, bacon for breakfast, burgers for lunch, and chicken for dinner, you are kind of full of shit.
Yeah, I would add to that it's the beef industry is the number one producer of agricultural greenhouse gases. Actually, the beef industry is actually the number two producer of greenhouse gases on the planet. Actually, greater than transport, or is equal to transport. One thing I would add on the vegan front, certainly increase your overall intake of vegetable products, bearing in mind that fungi, mushroom cultivation, can actually provide an awful lot of the nutrients which we traditionally get from meat products. So that's one thing we can consider, having urban mushroom farms as well as urban plant farms, considering that fungi don't require light, so they can actually be grown in the shadow of our urban farms. Another thing to consider is Jim mentioned aquaponics earlier, which is obviously an extremely efficient way of growing plants because you're feeding all of your vegetable waste to the fish poop in the water, the fish manure then goes into the plants, providing the plants with all the nutrients they need, and then all the waste products from plants can then be fed to worms and maggots, which in turn can get fed back to the fish. Now, fish is the most efficient converter of biomass into protein. I think 1.4 kilograms of fish feed will yield 1 kilogram of fish. So I'd also recommend a big shift towards fish as a source of protein if we want to move away from more unsustainable sources of protein like cattle, of course, and lamb.
I think we'll look back at this age in history with shock and horror at the violence that we've been perpetrating to animals. And sort of in the same way that we look back at some of the things our forebears did with shock and horror about how they treated people from different races or the slave trade and so on. It's hard to change it overnight. I think that it will be done stage by stage. I confess I am not yet 7 days a week vegan, but I am 4 days a week vegan, so that's a start. I'm doing a diet, which means that 4 days a week I have much more control over what I eat with special preparations with lots of vegetable stuff in it. It's done my health a power of good, and I look forward to going 7 days a week in due course. I think what will help people do this is when we get better and better at creating things that taste a bit like meat, but in a much different way. So it won't be meat from animals, it'll be meat from the labs. We're not quite there yet. I think the next 10 years is one huge, big growth in change in technology. And then we'll all look back with shame at what we've been doing. It's true that most of the animals are slaughtered in a, quote, humane way. But even if only 1% of 1% of 1% are not slaughtered humanely, it's absolutely terrible. And there is evidence that that's the case. So there's a big change ahead. And part of it will be done by people standing up and exerting a moral viewpoint, which I think is very important. And part of it will be enabled by gradual development of alternative foodstuffs.
Just one more personal thing to add. I think that you attract far more bees with honey than you do vinegar. So I think the going in on the moral argument of, for instance, David just said he's going, 4 days, he's making an effort, he's not fully militant vegan yet. And they'll use that term advisedly because there are those out there who would say, you're disgraceful for doing 4 days. What about the other 3? Or something. I don't know. There's a good joke. How do you know you're talking to a vegan at a party? Don't worry, they'll tell you. So I think why not go for the positive angle and say, actually, sorry to digress, but I did a Facebook post. I specifically said no vegans are allowed on this post. I'm asking a question of what you think would be the main reasons for someone going vegan. I wanted to prove the point that the general zeitgeist out there thinks the only reason you'd go vegan is because of the moral argument. There's your problem. They don't even know it's environmentally destructive. They don't even know how healthy and beneficial it is for you. Imagine if people actually thought, well, the best way of losing weight and being healthy is to have a plant-based diet most of the time. If people knew that, they'd be like, oh, they're doing it for good reasons, and then they feel better that they're not participating in that kind of level of destruction. Let's make people feel good about the choices they take, rather than make them, for the right reasons, rather than make them feel bad for it. I think, take a positive approach of communication. Right. Sorry.
Hi.
I'll wait for Sarah to. Oh, you got the mic.
Hello. Press. Hi. It was just a question, mainly for the guy from the Futurists. You were mentioning about this sort of advance in AI. Do you think that as the machines become more intelligent than humans, that they'll actually start deciding what to do for themselves?
Well, that depends how much freedom and autonomy we want to give them. And I think that's a very difficult question, because if we don't give them all the relevant knowledge, they may take decisions without appreciating some of the stuff that we regard as common sense, but we haven't managed to program into them. So I think for the time being, we should use them as tools rather than turning them into another intelligent species in their own right. So we'll feed them information, they'll give us lots of suggestions, and then we must take the decisions rather than them taking the decisions for us. Some people may want to cut corners and say it's going to be faster if the computers make the decisions without humans, but I think we must say, no, let's make sure we are still part of that loop. And if we can do that, then computers will serve us and be our enablers and be positive, rather than the risks of them doing what we asked them to do, but not what we intended to ask them to do.
Do you think they'll let us make that choice?
Well, it depends indeed how we program them, and so we have to be careful to ensure that we still understand what they're doing. There is some experimental programming in which we don't exactly know what the outcome will be. The internal evolution, it's a so-called black box systems in which they reach their own conclusions. If we had too much of that, then we're at risk of them reaching views which are different from how we intended it. This is a big subject, by the way. There's a big book that was produced last year called Superintelligence by a professor at Oxford called Nick Bostrom, and he talks at some length about the control problem, which is how do we keep control, and the specification problem, which is what goals should we set up for these things in the first place. We're not having enough discussion about this, and some of the discussion that does take place is a bit sensationalized. It's like the other discussions that the Zeitgeist Movement is trying to accelerate. It needs to be done in a careful, balanced way, taking lots of viewpoints into consideration. I think provided we do have that discussion, then we'll be able to guide the computers in a way that we remain in control and they help us to progress to humanity plus instead of into an Armageddon.
I think I don't know whether Einstein said this, but our technology has exceeded our humanity. I always quite liked that. I think Jacques Fresco said technology that doesn't enhance human well-being is just a useless bunch of junk with lights. Something like that. I quite like that too, notionally at least. Sorry, does anyone have any comments on?
Yeah, I'd recommend looking at some material by Raymond Kurzweil. Ray Kurzweil is one of the leading technologists. I'm sure David Wood is well familiar with his work. He argues that in about 30 years' time, as I said briefly in my talk, Ray Kurzweil foresees this time he calls a singularity, which is a time when the acceleration of the enhancement of computing and technology becomes so staggering that the human mind will no longer be able to keep up with it. And he does a whole load of discussion with regards to how we might augment our own minds. I think David mentioned that in his talk as well, how we can actually interface our own intelligence with computer intelligence so that we still ultimately hold sway, but the added intelligence is giving us the ability to understand and still maintain mastery over the machines that we create. If you look up The Singularity is Near, I think that's the book in which he lays down these ideas.
Next question.
Hi guys, great show so far, thanks. This one's mostly for Dave Lucas. It's about technological sustainability and leading by example. If we were all to, for example, get together and create some of these technological sustainability farms that we could lead by example by showing people how it works, do you think we could push the momentum into the third industrial revolution? Do you think we could actually bring people along with us, or are we too much sheeple following the system?
Yes, certainly, provided it's done in the right way. I think that we need to engage the academic community. The way I would see, an idea that I've kind of put forward before is the idea that we can actually build a social enterprise that can actually crowdfund some kind of university exercise. If we approached a university and said, well, here's some funding we've raised, we want you to do some postgraduate research with this funding in this particular field, engaging local communities as volunteers in the program and building collaboration with local people so that the postgrad researchers become the team leaders. Local people, particularly young unemployed people, can come along for the ride and to gain what knowledge they can in being volunteers, considering that those are the people that might be technologically unemployed anyway. And then if we keep involving the academic community every step of the way, then we've got structured research, structured direction, and each of our communities would then serve as a research program, which obviously attracts new money, new funding, new students. Obviously, academic journals would then give good coverage to the system. And that would actually make our farms a valuable research and development centre, rather than ending up as like a hippie commune on the fringe of the society that never gets to interact or influence the mainstream society.
I was going to just emphasise the educational standpoint as well. That if we're not looking out, if we're looking inwards, then we're not recognising how connected everything is, and we're not actually, eventually, we won't be able to keep the wolves away from the door, so to speak. We have to be looking outwards, and that's really where education comes in. So in terms of Sarah and myself are looking at doing a new project which goes into schools and not only talks about these things, but gets the kids involved in their local communities, building these sorts of platforms. One thing I would like to mention is there are obviously a lot of these types of groups out there. There's a lot of socially concerned groups. I'm always one for saying try not to do duplication. If there's someone out there who's doing something very similar to what you want to do, I think it's a good thing to jump on board, with those people with a ship that's already sailing, so to speak, so that we're not sort of dispersed too much. We're sort of punching in the same direction a little bit with a bit more punch. So, yeah, that's just one thing I would mention. Does anyone else have any comments on this? Okay, so could we take a next question, please?
Hello? Hi, sorry. Roger Irvin Dunn, Relatively Free Mind. First of all, my apologies for having missed the entire day, apart from the last gentleman's presentation. My question, okay. As we make this inevitable transition from our global market economy to a resource-based economy, or pre-resource-based economy, it occurs to me that we're inevitably going to have a clash between that new culture and the vested interests of the old culture. And seeing as that old culture includes the likes of the military-industrial complex and the medical-industrial complex, call it Ludditism in reverse if you like, how does the panel, or when does the panel, what stage of our transition, if you like, does the panel imagine that that clash will reach its height or climax? And what do they imagine the possible results of that clash would be?
Well, I think I'd start off by saying we definitely want to avoid that at all costs. That's essentially why the movement's here, is because we see these challenges, which lie ahead. We know that they'll be resisted, but that's why the value shift that we talk about is so important, because if we can shift enough of those values within some of those forces inside the establishment that maybe understand how things are, and we can change some of their values and the values. Remember, it's us who support that establishment. With our shared collective values, we sling mud at the politicians all day, but we don't seem to see the reflection in our own behaviour. We still go out and buy things. I mean, and all those sorts of things, and all of those that general negative zeitgeist, if you will, feeds into the machine. We're feeding the beast. We need to start by starving the beast. That's the first thing we have to do. We have to stop spending money. If we can avoid it, we have to think about these sorts of things and work out where we can shift away, and then hopefully we'll be able to make such a transition in a more peaceful way than we currently have.
Yeah, I think it's a case of planting a benign Trojan horse. Now, those people who are in the elites, as you say, the military-industrial complex, those who are very rich and very influential, they are in that position not to be cruel and domineering over the rest of the population, but because it's the way the monopoly game is played. And many people are, their lives are complicated by the fact that many of these elites get some sort of a gambling addiction. They sort of get induced into a sort of an addictive state. If you look at Gabor Mate's talk in Zeitgeist Moving Forward, he goes into that. So I think as far as the elites are concerned, they're aware of the fact that technological unemployment means that more and more people are disenfranchised, and there's more and more chance of the population getting angry and rising up in masses with pitchforks. So it's in their interests for that not to happen. It's in their interests for the disenfranchised to have some alternative means of getting their needs met, and thereby keeping them peaceful and not causing any trouble. So the system is naturally wearing itself down to a natural conclusion. It's the zero marginal cost society is spelling an end game for the capitalist model itself. Now, the capitalist model won't disappear altogether. It will just shrink into a niche market system. So I think that ultimately, even David Cameron in our current government has launched a thing called the Big Society. We haven't heard an awful lot about it lately, but he launched it sort of towards the beginning of his tenure as Prime Minister. The Big Society is really a collaborative commons. It basically says that the government's losing its financial ability to keep funding people who are more vulnerable, and therefore it's up to local social enterprises to take a bigger role in helping people meet their own needs using local skills and local resources. So that is a thinly veiled admission by our government. The fact that we actually need a collaborative commons to actually bolster up the failing market system in order to keep societal cohesion together. So I think the buzzword here is a benign Trojan horse.
What I have to say might not be totally relevant, and it's not on the wide scale, but rather on the little scale that I can think of. And the answer is perhaps to do the same as we were talking about when going vegan, not expect to go cold turkey, as it were, if that's not a rather strange mixture of metaphors, but to little by little. Because I think people are afraid of change, and particularly if you're in power, the idea of change is fearful because you're in a position of advantage. And if you remember that stepped graph I showed, within our society, to be richer is better. But so to lose that is very threatening. But even at work, sometimes you can say, well, in some circumstances, can we make this decision in a different way? Can we hear from everybody in the meeting rather than just hearing about the noisy and most assertive guys, and it probably usually is guys. I also thought of an example. We were talking about the basic income grant, and there's a group I know in South Africa. Now, South Africa is much more unequal even than the United States, and many of parts of the so-called poorer world are. But this was a society, a Quaker meeting actually, and they said, well, we're not going to persuade the government straight away to do this, so we'll do it ourselves. Within our Quaker meeting, anybody will contribute a secret amount, as much or as little as they want, and everybody will get 20 quid a month, whatever it was, 300 rand. And as there's no social service for adult people in South Africa, that was deeply significant. So people can have experiences of holding a meeting in a different way at work, or something they do in voluntary work where suddenly the power relations are different, and perhaps that can gradually persuade people that there isn't only one thing of doing things the hierarchical way.
Well, I'd like to build on some of these comments and just say I think we must avoid any thinking there's an inevitable clash between an us and a them. I think there must be ways to work with allies even in unlikely places. So the military-industrial complex sounds horrific, but actually many people inside the military are very worried about climate change because they can see it's a geopolitical risk. So there are many people in the military who want to explore very quickly alternative fuel solutions. So if we just think of them as some big monolithic class that we can't work with, then we're shutting ourselves to possible alliances. And then in terms of the 1%, the very rich people, I mean, as Dave Lucas said, some of them are very sensitive to the need for change. Dave talked about the person who spoke about if we're not careful, we're going to have the people rising up with pitchforks against us. This was written by Nick Hanauer, who's very wealthy because he was lucky enough to be one of the early investors in Amazon when it wasn't well known, Amazon.co. He's an extremely wealthy man with some other investments, but he has gone on public record several times saying, this is not a sustainable way to live. We must find a better way to distribute resources more equitably throughout the world, especially to the middle class, and so we can have a different kind of society growing. So let's not think in terms of inevitable clashes. Let's look for smart alliances.
So I'm Jacek, I'm from the TZM Poland, and first of all I wanted to thank you for this event because it's a very big dose of inspiration for me. And I have two questions, predominantly one for Mr. Wood and one for Mr. Wilkinson, but I would like all of your opinions be heard. The first question is, you were talking about this change that will inevitably go through probably the unconditional basic income to something like an RBE. Do you actually see any alternative that would that is possible? Because when I think about it, I see only total outwar and utter destruction. I can't see anything that is sustainable or that can last for longer than a couple of more decades maybe, other than the alternative that we are talking about here. And the question to Mr. Wilkinson is, could you elaborate a bit more about the problems that are present in the countries that do not reach a certain level of income that was described in the book, that was not mentioned here? Because all these countries that were presented in the graph are the rich countries, right? The poor countries were not mentioned. You mentioned them briefly right now, but I would like you to elaborate on that. Thank you.
What was the first question?
The first question was about, is there any alternative to what we are presenting?
I wanted to say it's unfortunate that Ben Dyson from Positive Money couldn't be here with us. From my own personal perspective, in the malaise of all these problems that we're facing, and even the model that the movement advocate, which obviously I support, and everything else, I actually think the most important thing we have to do first is what Positive Money are doing. That's my own personal perspective, because we live in a monetary system, we live in a money-based world, and if we keep getting economic collapses, then people don't have the purchasing power to initiate any of these ideas. Period. That's it. End of. So we can talk about funding until we're blue in the face, but where's that funding going to come from? because the monetary system is completely decoupled from the life ground. It's just money feeding money, feeding money. Most of what is ever generated is generated in stocks and shares, and not actually in the real economy. And a lot of the money stays in the hands of people who already have a lot of money. So funding is going to be a real problem. There's fantastic people doing great work out there. I've seen many of them at the Futurists events, and time again they say, well, we can't get funding for doing this program. If we could democratically get the money back in the control and the creation process under democratic hands, then we can say, oh, we've got this great transition networks, and transition towns deserve a mention as well, and we've got all these wonderful projects that the people have actually thought up, and now we actually have the finances to initiate them, and we can create jobs in the process, overcoming technological unemployment en route to a better world. As we do this, and we maybe bring in a universal basic income, and I hope we do. The early signs are very good. There's a great talk by Federico Pastono online called "What If Everybody Got Free Cash?" I highly recommend watching that. As people start to see that that's not just some lefty, idea or whatever, and actually they're starting to see people behave differently than how they would have expected them to. They thought, oh, I thought when you got free money you'd just sit around all day, and they're not doing that. They're actually going out in their communities and doing something beneficial. The values will shift even more. They'll say, well, why don't we, do this next, and slowly this third industrial revolution that Dave's talking about starts to take hold through the values, and we overcome the previous question issue as well, is that the more people who get on board, the less propensity there is for conflict and division. In terms of the poor countries, I'll hand that over there, but that would be my answer to that first question.
Okay, you remember our friend asked about, I think it was asked why the other countries in the world were left out. There were only about 30 to 50 countries, which are the richest. There are two reasons, and you have to bear in mind that those people who wrote the books, Kate and Richard, are epidemiologists, and they work with statistics. So that tells you about the first reason, which is that for many countries in the world, there are not the detailed statistics of all the indicators of health and obesity and life expectancy and so on. The other one, I need to paint for you a virtual PowerPoint slide. So I think you'll see it quite clearly. Here is life expectancy going up there, and here is income of countries, like the very early one that I showed you. But instead of starting at $20,000 and going up to $40,000 along the bottom, it starts at 0. So all the countries of the world, even the poorest, are included. And life expectancy goes up there, and it starts really low, about 40, and goes up to about 80. And what you see on the left-hand side of the graph is a very scattered set of points. Every country in the world, Zambia, Zimbabwe, Madagascar, Mauritius, everywhere you want, right up to, turns a corner, somewhere up by Cuba, around 9,000, and it flattens out into that bit I showed you. But this bit, in as much as it has a pattern at all, is very steep. So it answers the question, do you live longer if you are in a richer country? And the answer is definitely, in this part of the graph, yes. And that effect, the direct effect of poverty and absolute need, absolute poverty, not having enough to eat, not having good enough shelter, not having a good medical service, is very important and gives the answer yes. It's only once you've got to a certain level of income that it kind of flattens out and the effect of inequality becomes important. Now, I think the effect of inequality is still there, though masked by the absolute, because I think the effect of inequality is based on absolutely basic human tendencies, as I tried to describe. One illustration for me is South Africa. It's a country I've visited and worked in a little bit, mostly with kind of humanitarian and human rights organizations, one of which was concerned with domestic violence. The levels of domestic violence in South Africa are shocking, against women largely and against children, and all sorts of really horrible things like sexual abuse of babies and goodness knows, things we hadn't heard of until recently. And I say, why does this happen? Now, I think it happens, this is only my interpretation, because of society in South Africa was a society of organized disrespect. And I think that goes right into people. And in the case of Cain and Abel, looking to that well-known example, you notice that Cain, he didn't try and kill God, so it was God who disrespected him, but it was his brother who he killed, who was probably the youngest and weakest person on earth at the time. And so when people are disrespected, they don't fight back necessarily, pitchforks or not, against the people who've disrespected them. They hit somebody weaker. And I think those tendencies are happening all over the world. It's just that they're masked by the absolute poverty, and they don't appear on the graphs because there isn't the material by and large.
Hi.
Next question.
What kind of risks you see in our detached children with increasing technology? Our children are getting more emotionally detached from one another, and with increasing technology, this will probably be even worse. And what kind of solutions do you see?
Yeah, it is quite a struggle to get my 12-year-old daughter apart from her phone, to look up long enough to pay attention to the human beings around her. If I had a decent answer, she probably wouldn't be looking at her phone quite as much, so I'm not sure I'm the best person to ask. But yeah, the level of distraction is quite something. I would say I read an interesting thing, which was a letter from Aldous Huxley to George Orwell about 1984. Basically, he was congratulating him on it, but he said, I think I probably got it closer in Brave New World. Because he said that the thing that everybody seems to underestimate is our propensity for distraction. There's nothing, you know, keeping an iron boot in the face of humanity forever and ever and ever is actually quite inefficient way of controlling people. Probably the best way is bread and circus. I think the Romans came up with it. And I think if our technology, as it progresses, is unfortunately, as David mentioned, descending into the realms of cat videos. So it is quite disconcerting. Sorry, I can't put a positive spin on that. I'm sure someone else can. Sorry? Football leagues. So, sorry, I'm sure David can have a go.
Every generation is worried about their children. Every generation says, oh my God, these children are more difficult to look after, and they're more obsessed by whatever the latest fad is. And my son was obsessed with video games for a long time when he was young, but he's grown up as a rounded individual. I think in part it's because the people he played video games with were people who he wanted to meet in real life as well. So I'm not too worried about that effect. I am more worried, however, as James said, that some governments or some ruling classes may want to distract us from the real issues of the day by putting on more and more engrossing soap operas and other things which will take our attention away. And some of the news is human interest stories, but is by no means the most important things that are going on in society. So we have to fight back against that by making sure that we take advantage of our technology ourselves to push the news stories that we think should be more in people's mind. And we have to do that in a very creative way too, so that people are drawn to look at the news stories which deserve to be more in people's minds rather than the personal interest stories which are, in a sense, a distraction from the fundamental issues.
I don't have children. I was thinking of that program on Woman's Hour this last week about children being more and more anxious. I was really sad to meet a little boy in the last week, a rather tubby little boy. His mum says it doesn't matter because when he gets older than his present 4 years old, he'll start to run about and get thin. He says he wants a six-pack. And that seemed to me deeply pathetic, that he should be thinking about his appearance at that age. I think we've got a lot of responsibility to help kids have good experience. I'm sure they're fascinated by technology, but I don't think it's what they value most. I think kids have been asked what they value most, and they value time with their parents, which probably means shorter working hours for parents and more time, a switch of values there. I also think that technology can be used to be very unpleasant to people, and there is a very bad strand, isn't there, in the internet, and people who comment and troll and so on, and a lot of internet bullying, I believe. But I know school teachers who have managed to kind of flip round what happens in their classes, so that if there's a child who comes into the class who has a difficulty or a disadvantage or a disability, then that, quote, natural thing might be for that kid to get looked down on or teased or bullied. But she's managed to talk to the class and say, here's this person who's going to need our help. How can we help him? And the kids, at that stage, they're open to these suggestions, which are part of our natural human nature, if we encourage it and mold it and help it right. And so the class attitude flips around, not to one of bullying, but one of helping this person. So I think we've got a responsibility to give these opportunities. I think similarly, distrust has made that people roam about much less. Kids can't go out. When I was 13, I went and cycled around France with my 15-year-old brother. I don't think people would allow their kids to do that now, probably. There was nobody else, there were no adults there. That's a pity. That was a great freedom. And we need to set about making a society which is more trustful and enables our kids to play in the street and get about and have adventures and not be afraid.
Next question.
Hi, my name's Amanda. I've been talking about, and I'm probably not the only one, and I'm not the only one because there's many people I've met over my life through my travels and just in general living life that, it's a bit of a no-brainer to go with this movement. But I always get negative comments back to me, like in the office, it was just by chance that I was just talking to someone last year at dancing away in Brighton's Gay Pride Festival, and this guy comes up to me and just starts talking to me, and I thought, okay, so chat, got into life talk, and then he introduced me going, have you ever watched this Zeitgeist? And I thought, what? So he goes, go home, Amanda, and watch Zeitgeist. Now, I haven't seen the whole 3 of them, and I thought, wow, this has been actually advertised for the last how many years? I think it was 2011, but I think earlier now you're saying 2007. But so I went to work the next day after looking at some of this YouTube stuff, and I go to everyone, we've got to get rid of the monetary policy. There's always something I'm trying to, it's always got to be about values and principles, and they've definitely gone out the window. And not with everyone, thank God, because there are a lot of people out there. But how do you, have you been on current affairs? Because I never heard that there was a movement really where you're out here trying to install the values in people to live that lifestyle so we can get rid of all this crap that is causing the crimes and the whole. What can I do? I could get a whole lot of people involved. Basically, you got Facebook, you got, but everyone sort of gives up. They don't know.
I think to just paraphrase some of the suggestions you've already made is how to get involved.
Right.
Every journey starts with the smallest step, right? So the thing is just get started. Just do something, and you learn your mistakes, as you go along. You can't, whatever you must do if you're transmitting this is please don't come to this thinking that you're going to get everything right and the world's going to be sorted next month.
Yeah, I know.
As I said in my talk, I think it's so important that in a funny kind of way we detach ourselves from the outcome. It's healthier for us. And it helps us be better in our communications, because if we're constantly thinking, oh, it's all buggered and it's your fault for not seeing it, it doesn't help anybody. I think it's better to actually, as I said in my talk, ask yourself, once properly questioned and once properly understood, what makes sense, and then just drive the bus and accept whatever comes. It's not going to be an easy path to walk, because most people don't appreciate being told that some of their values, don't make sense, and so.
And you've got the people who've got their, 15 properties, and they've got the ones that are pretty, set where they are. Like, this is where I'm finding it hard. And you've got the mafias, and you've got the corrupt. How do you, like?
Go and give them a Christmas hamper and a hug.
I mean, with that separate entity, even the one that you're, don't with the banks anymore. Let's just take the power away from them,
Well, I think this, and we mentioned this earlier, that this us and them mentality has got to go. I think we have to say, look, to coin a word from High School Musical, or a phrase, we're all in this together. Never thought I'd quote that. But we really are all in this together, and that 1% are really only doing the best out of a game we all play, called money. And that's all it is. It's just a game. We can play a new game, but we just have to start playing it. That's how you start playing new games, right? So maybe naively, but I did kind of mean what I said earlier. Go give them a hug. Like, my family, my family, for instance, at Christmas, now know better than to give me a present. They know what they'll get in return. They will get time vouchers. That's all I give out at Christmas. I don't give, at the end of the day, time is the only form of currency we have on this planet, and that's all I give out. And if you don't get a time voucher, then it means you didn't fall into the list. But
true, I grew up that way because I come from a family of 11 anyway, and our family.
And that's how you do it. You be the light of change you wish to see in the world. So when it comes to Christmas, I go out. Myself and Sarah again have a campaign called The First Christmas on Facebook, done through the movement, but it's not technically a movement project, where you put a little golden C on your Facebook profile picture. If you share it, go on Facebook, you'll see it. And what that means is you're saying to your family and friends that if they were intending to buy you something for Christmas and they can't think of anything that you actually need, or that maybe is based around time or anything like that, please give the equivalent amount of money that they were going to spend to a charity of either their choice or your choice. Now, charity isn't the answer that the movement advocate. I mean, a charity is an admittance of system failure as far as I'm concerned. But nonetheless, if we're going to start this giving mentality, if we're going to start this gift economy, then where better to start it with a festival that purports to be about that, but is obviously nothing to do with it at the moment. We could shift that value. We can take that value and turn it into something positive. Much as we were saying earlier with the bankers, we need to try to take the positives and drive them rather than at the negatives, I would say. So.
One very brief point I'd add is keep learning. I mean, there's a host of videos, even all the TED Talks that are available that we share on the Zeitgeist Movement Facebook page. There are numerous lectures, as well as Peter Joseph's very informative documentaries. There's a whole host of different documentaries and lectures and journals out there that you could be exploring. Make a point of reading more books. I mean, I've been reading a lot more books since I joined the Zeitgeist Movement, so I've been trying to learn more about certain topics just to get a feel of what my fields of interest are that I can maybe contribute the most to in explaining ideas to other people, so I can help to inspire other people with thinking about topics I better understand. Of course, the more I learn, the more I realise that there still is to learn. I'm how much of a student, a green student I still am at learning the whole process. But I think that's the best way to teach others. Never give up being a student yourself. Do you know, Dave, a little bit about the stalls, maybe?
Yeah, we actually run an info store here on in the London chapter and in Liverpool as well. And sorry? Okay. Yeah. I think we should reach all avenues. in any way we can, actually. I was just talking about the info stalls, and it's a good way of getting the message out there, and you actually learn quite a lot. I know some people don't have the courage to talk about this stuff in everyday life, at work, with family, friends. But when you're at an info stall, you've got someone who's willing to actually speak to you, who's willing to look at what you're giving them, and they're going to be asking you a question. It's a great platform to actually learn how to talk about these things, and it can be quite a laugh, actually. I know I do it every month, at least once a month, and yeah. So, should we?
Sorry, I know I ran away. I was just thinking.
Well, actually, we're not sure. I think it's next Saturday. So keep your eye on the meetup sites and on Facebook, on the London Facebook page. It'd probably be South Bank. We've had quite a good interest in South Bank, actually, because we've got all the art centres there, and you've got people that are just generally more open-minded there. So would you like to, should we have the next question?
Sorry, I had a poignant slide on here that I wanted to use to address that. Could you switch to this one, please? Speaking of street stall activism, satire is always a good way of getting this message across. This is just something I knocked up last night, an idea I had over the last few days. This is kind of how I think we can get across, is that when you do a movement stall, it's always good to have people come towards you rather, through their own internal process, where they're like, I'm actually interested and I want to speak to them, rather than us running out, please talk to us. So obviously the elections are coming up, and something like this, I think, is just a bit of fun, really. Some could say it's negative, I suppose. I just think it's a bit of fun, and people are obviously thinking about this at the moment, so that they'd say, well, if it's none of the above, then what are you even talking about? And that gets us into a conversation. So hopefully over the next couple of weeks, we're going to put on some street stalls, and we've got just a couple of these little signs to stick up on the front, maybe to help engage in conversation. This is what I mean, is sort of talking to the zeitgeist on wherever that is currently. So we have these elections coming up. It's a good idea to sort of come in on that note. In more movement related sort of stuff, as I said, we are looking to get more people involved. We have positions to fill. Please remember that we've got those sheets outside to sign. And some positions on those sheets as suggestions for where you feel you might be able to get involved. Sign up on our meetup and come to one of our meetings to explore how to deliver this sort of train of thought and get involved with doing it. As I said, we have very few people who are really dedicated and in the machine, so to speak, of this. For instance, we want to do a north, south, east, west London street teams and make them really efficient and really work, so that we're doing this on a efficient sort of level.
Can you set up the list, please?
Right. I'll put
now.
that list up now as we break up just at the end. But I think we have run over a bit, and we can take maybe one last question. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, firstly, thank you for today. It's been an amazing day, and I just have some observations and a quick question, hopefully. That particularly with regards to technological unemployment, it seems to be talked about in a fairly negative way generally, and with the impact of the loss of jobs, etc. Arthur C. Clarke said the goal of humanity is full unemployment, so that we can play. And I think there's there's an opportunity to look at it another way, because with the rise of robots and with fewer traditional jobs comes an opportunity to consider the question of, what is it that we as human beings can uniquely contribute that robots can't do, and how can we add value in other ways? And so it's really a way of having people become more creative, because even in a resource-based economy or with universal basic income, we're all going to want to be engaged in work that has us feel fulfilled and gives us our self-respect and our self-worth, and do things that we're inspired by and that we're passionate about, things we naturally love doing. Someone said there are no lazy people, only people who are uninspired. And clearly, we need more people doing this work, and we need to mobilize huge amounts of people to implement real solutions, which would be, we'd have that manpower available if we weren't all doing things currently that could be done by robots. And if we were free to choose meaningful occupations arising out of an inquiry of what the population actually needs and what we actually want to do and what we need to do, including giving quality time to our children, we could have a very different view. We could become a lot more creative. So I guess my question really is, do you think that the upside of technological unemployment is the increase in creativity in terms of looking at all of that? And can you comment on any other benefits of this kind of inevitability, and also what you see is the role of entrepreneurialism and social entrepreneurialism?
I think I would just mention one name and one book who's really tried to cast, that's perfect for you to read, and that's really helped cast this issue, I feel, in the right light, and that's Federico Pastono's book, Robots Will Steal Your Job, But That's Okay, How to Survive the Economic Collapse and Be Happy. Because he really wrestled that away from, I think, the doom and gloom that you're talking about, and said, guys, this is a great opportunity for us to ask the question of, we finally we don't necessarily have to struggle to actually meet life's needs, and now we can actually build the good society, as Martin Luther King called it. And I think that encompasses what you're talking about, and I think Federico is a wonderful beacon for that type of vision of what we could do with this coming trend of technological unemployment. I mean, we made technology to make our life easier. Why, if it's taking over the crappy, mundane, monotonous and dangerous labor jobs, is that suddenly a bad thing? How on earth have we arrived at a society where we can actually have a narrative where that's a negative thing? If you think about it for a second, it's laughable. Imagine a caveman sitting there and going, I don't know about this fire shit. It doesn't make any sense. It's madness, That would be my perspective.
In the long run, and maybe quite soon, maybe 10 or 20 years, it should be wonderful, because we'll be able to concentrate on all the things we'd like to do. Personally, I'd love to travel more in some carbon-free way and see more of the world. I'd love to study more music. I'd love to experience all the music, and I'd love to read lots of science fiction. I'd love to study mathematics, which I never quite finished. So that's what I'd love to do in the longer run. But the issue is in the shorter term. In the shorter term, more people will be displaced from the workforce, because guess what? The robots can do it more cheaply than we can do. And more people may therefore be pushed out of the normal part of society and be struggling for finance, and they may be regarded by the state as lazy and ineffective and be despised. So that is the short-term crisis. And we can solve the short-term crisis by educating people about kind of change in the zeitgeist, and by getting on quickly to some redistribution systems such as basic income. So in the short term, that's where the worry is, and it could be very worrying, which is why we've got to talk about it and raise people's consciousness about the full range of possibilities. In terms of entrepreneurship, that's a big question. It could have us all talking for half an hour at least. I think there is a role for entrepreneurs as well. Not all entrepreneurs are dangerous. I think some entrepreneurs can transform the world in a very positive way. So despite what you might think about Google and Apple, I think the entrepreneurs behind them have actually done a power to make technology more widely accessible and more useful. But entrepreneurs have got their own risks, and we have to make sure that entrepreneurs don't get all their own way. There is this risk towards monopoly and all the market failures that James talked about in his talk. So we need to stop entrepreneurs just having everything their own way. We need to allow some of them to flourish in ways that we decide make sense for society. If we can do that, we can have the benefits of their energy and their enthusiasm, but in a way that really is for everybody's good rather than just the good of a small proportion of society.
A slightly disturbing thought has come to mind. When I started work in the 60s, that's when I started being employed, people said exactly the same thing. They said, machinery is getting so much more efficient, productivity is so much greater, that in a few years' time, we won't have enough to do. We'll have so much leisure, we won't know what to do. Now, I take your point entirely, but I think we could ask, why didn't we get there? Why is it not like we thought it was going to be? And it's because we have our minds fixed on status and competition and succeeding through job status and having more stuff. And that's an illusion. It's not helpful to us, and we've got to get off that. It's only if we can get off that that we can say, no, I don't need to have this better job. I don't need to work more. In the little book, A Convenient Truth, Richard and Kate show how if the productivity increase, which isn't happening in Britain but should be and is happening in most places, was distributed to everybody rather than only to the capital owners, which is what's happening at the moment, it could well be expressed in free time. So every couple of years we get say 4 or 5% more productivity. So that means we can work 4 or 5% less and have more time for doing all those things you have and gradually ease into this position, helped by technological change. But it'll have to be a conscious choice. It'll have to involve a change of values as well as a change of technology.
I'll add to that, Jeremy Rifkin, whose work I mentioned in my talk, is the founder of the Foundation on Economic Trends. And one key trend he reports on is the fact that as the collaborative commons is growing, which it's doing by 13% per annum, whilst the market economy stagnates, financial capital is giving way to social capital. And we're getting more and more sophisticated systems online where people are building up social capital by means of ranking by their peers, peer ranking systems. We're seeing this on things like eBay when people get ranking scores if they are a very good trader, very good seller. Interviews he's conducted have shown that people have respond very positively, take this very seriously. Their rankings are actually becoming more psychologically important to people across the collaborative commons than financial capital, recognising that, of course, technological unemployment puts financial capital beyond more people's practical reach anyway.
I think satire can help sum up this issue quite well. So Steve Hughes, who's a comedian, has a very funny sketch on this. He says, jobs can get fucked. Everything's already built. Which I always liked. We don't really need to do anything. We could have 5 days off and 2 days on. We've got it the wrong way round. Shouldn't have 5 days on, 2 days off. We should have 2 days on, 5 days off. Because the good thing about that is tomorrow, what's tomorrow? Last day. I think we could all work 2 days for this system, right? I could work 2 days. I could do anything for 2 days. It'd be fine. I'd get 5 days off to sit around and evolve, which is, I think, what we've got to try to do. So on that note, I think we'll call it a close. Half an hour later than where I said, but I just figured that Q&A was going so well. I didn't want to derail it. Thank you so much for coming today. It really does mean so much to us when we've gone to all this effort to put everything on. Well, I say we, mainly David, who's been brilliant. So. Let's talk amongst ourselves, come and have a chat with us, and let's go and resolve all this down the pub.
Cheers. I'd just like to say a few thank yous. There's been a lot of volunteers here. I want to thank all the speakers for giving fantastic talks. They're brilliant. Which will all be eventually up online. And I want to thank Michael for doing the graphics, doing a lot of hard work. I want to thank both of our cameramen, Ben and Stephen. And Pete for taking photos, and all the extra volunteers who's willing to do the ticket sales, ushers, and all the rest of it, and there's many other people I could mention, but yeah, thank you so much for this. It's the first time I've actually done something on this scale, and it's just been beautiful to see people put their time in, and it's been great. Thank you. Cheers.